Hello everyone, my name is Sunil Pareek and today we are shifting our gear from SRV6. So if you are tracking this channel, we are recording since past few weeks uh, some sessions on SRV6. We have recorded few and I will cover like one more session to complete that SRV6 story. But topic for today is another interesting 5G topic, which is private 5G for the enterprises. And if you are tracking this telco market, you see that there is a lot of traction around private 5G that even enterprises are interested in seeing what it can provide uh, to the enterprise. The telcos are looking at what business benefits it can offer to telcos, and even the vendor community has also looking at how it can make the deployment easier for their customers, be it a telco who is offering this service to their customer, which is enterprise, or maybe in some cases directly to the enterprises, right? So in this session, and of course there will be few sessions as a part of this, because it is very difficult to cover private 5G in a single session. So what I will do will record multiple sessions, and today we will talk about the big why behind private 5G. Why in the first place enterprises, telcos, vendors are talking about private 5G. What is that big change that is driving all these discussions? So we will talk about that change as well, right? So one thing before I want to make clear before getting into this discussion is that I will not talk, at least in this session, any of the technical level details of private 5G. I will be keeping this session at a high level. So this intended audience for this is the business leaders, the solution architects, or the network engineers who want to understand what basically private 5G is bringing to enterprises. And I will cover one or two real use cases as well where I was involved into these discussions with the enterprise, and we were discussing how private 5G can help them. So if you are someone who is walking into this discussion with the technical intentions, then this session is not for you. So with that, let's just start our discussion, and I want to start this with what is the current situation for the service providers, right? We are into 2023, we are talking about 5G, but if I look at, let's say, just myself, I'm using cell phone since my college days, and though I have upgraded my phone few times to keep up with, of course, with the pace that is happening in and around us, but the usage of my cell phone, right, over a period of time due to all these changes have increased a lot. Like earlier in the college days, I normally use my cell phone to make calls or maybe send SMS to the friends, to now, or when these 4G was maturing, like we started watching the videos on the cell phone, then booking the cabs, or ordering food or whatever, right? There are so many things that can be done with this single device that is in the pocket, right? So what was happening is that the usage of my cell phone or the dependencies have increased exponentially. But then what was not changing surprisingly, or which was like more or less the flat in a span of these 15 years, was my phone bill. When the data consumption was increasing, I was a bit worried that now the phone bill will be high. And even now with 4G, everybody has this cell phone with them. Even in a family, multiple members have their own phones. But at the same time, the bill was not increasing. So, and then if I compare this, like I was, the usage trends that I see, I was actually paying less. So, this is actually good news for me, but not necessarily for the providers who are providing that service. Right? If we look at India, Airtel, Jio, Vodafone, and if they tend to increase the price, normally it's a price sensitive market, so user just shift the connection. And with 4G, somewhere around 2016, when Geo Wave came in, right, there was a tagline that India will never pay for the phone calls. They only charge for the data, and that too was very nominal, and which has resulted in other providers as well to reduce their charges. So, what does that mean? That the providers were struggling with ARPUs, which is average revenue per user. This is actually a business metric that telcos track. But this was a situation not only with India, even the global service providers were not that happy with their ARPUs, where with every G that you see here, right? G stand for generation. We had seen the transition from 3G, or some of you might have seen the 2G as well, right? 2G to 3G to 4G, and now we are talking about 5G. So with all these Gs that we see here, the service expectations, the reliability, the connectivity expectation from the service provider was always in the upward directions, right? We had expected more and more better experience after these transitions, but at the same time, the bill that we were paying was like this only, right? So this is actually a problem that the SPs are struggling with, and now they are investing heavily to deploy 5G, right? So now it is happening across the world that SPs are enabling their infrastructure for 5G. And in India, like Jio, Airtel, they are spending massive amount of money and the manpower in deploying 5G. And there was a news some time back that Jio had enabled 100 cities, and they are targeting to cover whole India in 2023. Remember how much time it took uh, to cover the whole India for 4G, and it will take very less time when we are talking about 5G, right? But so far with 4G, if we look at the pattern for the SPs, right? Their main consumers were people like you and me, right? It was 4G, and the most of the revenue was coming from the end users and the consumers like you and me. Then there was a very small fractions of the revenue was coming from the enterprises, be it automotive, healthcare, transport, or utilities. Right? and operator business was mostly focused on this. But now this is actually a saturated market where already, like in the developed nations, 100% of the people have the cell phone already, or in the developing countries like India, this number is like, I don't have the authentic figures with me, but uh, like more than 80 to 90% of the people already have these cell phones. So definitely looking at this trend and the transition to 5G and the investment that it required from the operator's perspective doesn't make much sense, because they see that they are looking at a saturated market, right? And even with 4G, if we look, the data consumptions, right, that had grown exponentially, right? If I see that, okay, this represents the data, and with the video growth, right, the data has been going up exponentially, the data consumptions, right? So, what exactly the private 5G brings, right? Or 5G brings opportunity basically. Let's not talk about private 5G for now. Let's just look at only the 5G part of it. So, as we see that this consumer market is already saturated, so service providers don't see a good level of potential in this market by selling the SIM card to the consumers. So what they are doing, what they are their plan is to sell the SIM cards to machines. When I say machines, these can be sensors or cars or another manufacturing equipments. So if they can connect this, and these are actually used by in the enterprise market, right? So that's where they see that there is a potential revenue. So this curve that you see here with 5G, they are trying to expand, and it may be somewhere like this. So there can be like a 50-50% on the enterprise as well as on the consumer side, right? So if I say this statement, like enterprises will be the biggest consumer of 5G, that actually do the justice looking at these numbers and the use cases that I will be covering in our next slide. So now with this situation, right, and that we see the transition that is happening towards 5G, now let's see what we will be looking in this session. So what we will look at is why we are talking about enterprise private 5G, though I have given that context, right? But that was like more of the situation from the service provider side. Now let's look at come on the enterprise side, and let's talk about why they are talking about it. And then we will conclude this session like what exactly is private 5G. I will give you a high level definition and some components of it, and then we will wrap up our session. So whenever, right, we talk about enterprises, normally such type of image comes to our mind. Now we take our bags, we go to office, and this is like a kind of environment where we sit in and we do our work, right? And these are actually the pictures that I have taken from internet, but this is how a enterprise looks like. But there is another like whole complete different segments of enterprises that look exactly different from what you are seeing on the screen right now. And I will give you one example. I will show you one picture to give you the context, and that is something like this. So this is actually a mining industry, and normally these type of industries, which also fits in our definition of enterprises. So don't think when you think of enterprise is just that carpet office area. It can be a mining company like this, or it can be a manufacturing plants, or any other such industry which is spread across acres of land, and that is normally outside of the city limit, where the connectivity even from the public providers is sometimes a challenge, right? So let's cover one use case related to this, since we are talking about this mining. What actually happened at the start, I think it was somewhere around 2022, I was pulled into a enterprise design discussions, and this is what I have done for most of my career. We are working with service providers or enterprises and designing their network, meeting the requirements. So I thought this is just like the same discussion, same requirements, more or less, that I had done throughout my career. So I went into that discussion, and this was started with like they wanted to have uh, the network with like general requirements like high availability. I was listening in the call, and reliability, that it should be a reliable network, and there were some other requirements as well, like from the coverage perspective. And fortunately or unfortunately, I was a bit late in that call, so I missed the initial discussion. So I thought it was a recorded meeting, so first plan was to watch that recording later on. But then suddenly what happened is, when I was writing down all these requirements, and already like being any other network engineer, right, making their network in the back of my mind, core, access, distribution, like how we will connect, where the layer 2 will go, where the layer 3 will go. But suddenly one of their principal architect started talking, and he said that, Sunil, here actually we are talking about a mine which is outside the city, and it's like from the length and breadth perspective, it is 5 miles side by side. And he had actually shown me a picture similar to this. Now, it is not that I took this from the internet, but he showed that there were few peoples working in that mines. And he was telling that so far, or throughout these years, when they were operating these mines, right, they were working in a model like this, where in the mine there are multiple peoples working adjacent to each other. And one reason for that was, if something happens to a person, their colleagues were responsible to inform the central security unit that there is something that has happened, and they were supposed to ask the help. And now they are actually looking at optimizing the workforce. And this architect told that this was the reason his team was hired, that how they can bring certain level of optimization into this. And he was proposing that now we want like limited set of people to work in an area, and we want to use machines to help them out. But at the same time, to address people's concern around security, remember earlier the people who were working adjacent or nearby, they were responsible to inform in case something happens, right? So he was telling that now this they actually want to offload to these sensors. So what this guy was thinking that he was telling to me that Sunil, we want to have certain sensors on the bodies of these workers. So if these sensors detect some unusual behavior like a fall or some other casualties, or if the user itself or that person, the worker itself want to inform, then he can use those sensors, and we want a network by which this information can be communicated to the central security unit so that the help can reach. And this was like, wow, they want to use the network, that too in a mining, to save people's life. There is so much of dependencies in a network, right? On a network. And I was not talking to a healthcare industry. There we can understand, but this was a mining. They were talking about this critical use case, and I can understand how much reliable network they need. And that's where I stopped writing like pen and paper with all these traditional network design that was going in my uh, back of my mind, and I just listened to that guy. So to give you the context, this was actually the first use case, that too from this industry, mining, where I was able to clearly see that there is this digitization is happening, and connectivity is the key enabler for this digitization. Right? So they need this reliable connectivity, be it Wi-Fi or private 5G, that we will jump later on, but I hope you understand the use case. And then on the similar lines, I was also having a discussion with a automobile company where they wanted to expand their network boundary outside of their factory and wanted to cover some bigger parking lots as well. And I was uh, like, okay, we can cover that with Wi-Fi, but then they shown me the demographics. They shown that okay, this is a very big area, and covering this with Wi-Fi will cost them a lot. So I asked them the use case, and they say that uh, when a car comes out of a manufacturing unit, it goes there in the parking lot for some time, and now with more and more of these software dependencies, like there are softwares in the car as well, they see sometimes the requirement of upgrading the software. So if the car is there in the parking lot, how can they push this software uh, in that parking lot, which is by the way very huge, right? So that's where they wanted a connectivity option which can cover their wide area, but at the same time it should also be reliable, and it should be able to suffice their requirement. So this is where I was initially thinking about that, okay, this can be covered with Wi-Fi. But think like this was spread across acres, the parking lot. And if we need to cover with the APs for wireless, how many APs we need to deploy, right? So both the use cases which I told were inclined towards 5G, right? So and this is something that enterprises across the world are exploring, like how this 5G can help them in their transformation towards industry 4.0. I covered two use cases, but there are many of such use cases in healthcare, in oil and gas, or like all these, or in manufacturing plants, right? So There are plethora of use cases, and this is something, uh, that is this journey of towards private 5G has already started. So if you look at these pictures, right, these are, by looking at the pictures, you can see that this is a automobile plant, which is like very huge by looking at the picture itself. And I had taken it from the internet, and this is actually in India, and it's in Pune, Mahindra Chakan plant. And there was a news sometime back that it had become India's first 5G enabled auto manufacturing unit. And this was the statement from them that this 5G for business solution had significantly enhanced the Chakan's network connectivity that had resulted in improved speed for software flashing. And it is a critical operation for vehicle dispatch. So ultra low latency, high speed network allows these managers to take multiple parallel sessions, and which has resulted in lower turnaround time for an operations, right? So this was clearly the business benefit, that by deploying private 5G or by deploying captive 5G, both are interchangeable, that Mahindra's Chakan plant was getting. And this was done by Airtel actually. And there was another rule news on the similar lines. It says that Airtel deploys private network at Mahindra's Chakan plant, and this was India's first 5G enabled auto manufacturing unit. And remember, this is just the start, right? In 2023, we are going at a faster pace with 5G. So our enterprises are also looking at this, and it is actually beneficial for the operators as well, for the reasons that I had covered in the initial part of this session, right? So with all these use cases, right? Now let's just talk about why even so much of interest in private 5G. Why these enterprises? Yes, we had seen these use cases, right? But why they see that private 5G is a potential enabler for meeting these digitization demand. And that is because of the regulatory changes that are happening for spectrum that is available for private use. Regulators across the world are opening some spectrum that is directly available to these enterprises for private consumptions, right? Now enterprises, they, well, technically they don't need to rely on their operator. They can directly go to the government, to the regulators, pay some bucks, and get this spectrum. Or even these providers, these service providers, like the one example that we had seen for Mahindra Pune, they can take the help of these service providers and deploy this private 5G network, which is just dedicated for them, right? And the second reason, of course, we have touched like these unique 5G capabilities that are enabling this customer digitization journey, this industry 4.0 transformation, right? If we look at 5G, there are use cases for URLLC, ultra low reliable latency, MMIoT, right? Where massive machine to machine type conversation, right? If you remember, like initially I was telling that now the SIM cards operators are looking to sell it to machines, and on machines there can be multiple sensors, right? So that's where uh, the provider sees a potential, and this is actually a use case for 5G as well, MMTC. And third one is the EMBB, enhanced mobile broadband, right? Massive bandwidth for the applications. So these are the three use cases which are actually helping even the enterprises in their journey. So with respect to the first point, as I was showing earlier, these spectrums that you see, right? So these are the countries, for example, Germany, there is this spectrum available for private consumptions by the enterprises. Even in Asia, if we look at Japan, right, where even the spectrum is available in the wave segment as well. And if you don't understand these things, I also started a series on 5G. Need to record some more sessions there, but some basics of 5G I am covering in that as well. So you may go and watch that. But the point for this slide is that Australia, Hong Kong, Japan, Germany, Sweden, right? You name it. Even in US also, there is a spectrum, CBRS, which is used for these private consumptions, right? So now we had seen that from the enterprise side, there are use cases. From the regulator side, there is a change in the policy which actually favors them. And then even from the SP also, we had seen that, okay, they see also this as a potential market and making their infrastructure ready for 5G so that they can offer these services to these enterprises. So we have covered this story from all these three directions, let's say. Now let's look at what exactly 5G is. So 5G is a technology at a very high level. If you ask me, like 60 or 70,000 feet view of this, it's a technology that is solving all our problems, be it enterprise, be it individual consumers, smart homes, smart cities, you name it, right? Everything. If you talk to your providers, if you talk to the vendors or anybody, they will say 5G, right? So this is being used like a Swiss Army knife kind of a thing, which one technology is solving all the problems. But that was on the fun side. Let's just look at what is private 5G. So private 5G is, of course, this is a 3GPP 5G technology, but listen to me very carefully that it is, if the word private is there along with 5G, it's dedicated to carrying a traffic from a specific entity. In case of Mahindra's Chakan plant, it is only that plant they can use that 5G network. So be it enterprise or public sector agency, it is just dedicated for them. So the whole ecosystem that you see from UE, the spectrum, the RAN part, and the core part, everything or every piece of it is dedicated for an enterprise. And there are different ways to deploy this. We will cover that maybe in some other session, right? And like we will talk about UE, spectrum, radios, core network, up to some extent in our subsequent sessions. But for now, you understand this, that all this infra that you see here is deployed for a particular entity if it is private 5G, right? Now, let's just look at the differences between a public network and a private network. So public 5G versus private 5G. So if we start from our spectrum, so let's say if it is Verizon, Airtel, Geo, the spectrum will be owned by carrier. But if it is an enterprise, there are different models, there are different deployment models that exist there, and we will talk in our subsequent session. But for now, it can be owned by that enterprise. It can be a shared spectrum like CBRS. This is, by the way, in US. Or providers like Geo, Airtel, they can lease some of their spectrum to the enterprise, and in return, they can charge something to them, right? What are the use cases? So use cases we had seen, right? For 4G or 5G, like let me write it here. Mainly, it is the traditional consumers, but for private space, it is the enterprise, right? Here it is user like you and me, but then there is a shifting gear that we had seen, and enterprises will also consume in a private manner. Infrastructure, it's owned by the carrier, but in case of enterprise, it can be either owned by enterprise, or a provider can provide it as a service to the enterprise, so that it's like become a ready-made solution for enterprise, and they can consume it. Same goes for the data and the management. In case of public 5G, it is managed by the carrier. But in case of private, there are different models that exist. It can be either managed by enterprise itself, right? Or SP can offer it as a managed service, or it can be like a vendor like Cisco or any other vendor who can also manage this on behalf of enterprise, so that they are not worried about the management of it, right? So this is at a high level the differences between public versus private. So now I will be closing it with a question that I often get whenever I deliver such sessions, is that in the enterprise, we already see that there is Wi-Fi, right? So do you foresee that private 5G can replace Wi-Fi? So answer to that is, I will like answer it with a quote, uh, you know, that with sufficient thrust, right, pigs fly just fine, but then somebody has to pay for that thrust, right? So what does that mean? That if there are use cases, right, that can be met with Wi-Fi, stick with that, go with Wi-Fi. Or if there are some use cases that can be met with 5G, go with 5G option of it, right? So look at your use cases first and then choose the technology. I will open it up more in our subsequent sessions, but for now, this is what was the plan for today. I hope this session was informative for you, and I would like to say thanks a lot for viewing.